Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to really unpack the recent contest for North Carolina Supreme Court Associate Justice Seat 6.
Right. That was a fascinating one.
Our sources today, mostly news reports, some legal filings, they paint this picture of an incredibly tight race.
Yeah, I mean, Jefferson Griffin was trailing Allison Riggs by just 734 votes.
734.
Right.
Out of over 5.5 million cast. That is, well, it's a sliver of a margin.
Absolutely tiny. And, as you can imagine, a margin like that sets off a whole chain of events, a pretty complex series, actually.
It really does. When an election is that close, every single step in verifying the result, it just comes under this intense scrutiny.
Mm-hmm. It really puts the details of our electoral system, under a microscope.
Exactly. So with that razor-thin difference, the process moved forward. State law itself triggered a statewide machine recount.
That's the first automatic step, yeah.
But, well, that wasn't the end of the story. Griffin, as the trailing candidate, then requested a partial hand recount.
Which is his right under the law in that situation.
Okay, so when we talk about a partial hand recount, what exactly are we talking about? What does that involve?
So in North Carolina, after that initial machine recount, the trailing candidate can ask for this manual count, but only from a sample of places.
The sample.
Yeah. Specifically, each of the 100 county boards of elections, they have to hand count all the ballots from 3% of their precincts.
Yep.
And also 3% of their early voting locations.
Okay, 3%. And I remember reading they have to round up, right?
Correct. Round up. So if 3% is like 2.1 precincts, they do 3.
And the early voting sites count as their own precincts for this.
Exactly right. Each early voting site is treated just like a precinct for doing that calculation.
Gotcha. So this isn't like a full manual recount right away. It's more like taking a snapshot.
Mm-hmm. A representative sample to see if there are, significant discrepancies compared to the machine count.
And the whole point of looking at this 3% sample is it basically to figure out if a full statewide hand recount might actually be needed.
Precisely. The idea is you look at the errors or discrepancies you find in that hand-counted sample.
Okay.
Then you kind of project those findings across the entire state.
Like statistically estimate the total impact.
Exactly. And if those projected differences are big enough that they could potentially change the outcome of the election as the machines reported it.
Then what?
Then the State Board of Elections could order a full hand-eye recount of every single ballot in that specific race.
Okay. But, here's where things seem to take a turn, maybe beyond just the standard recount process.
Mm-hmm.
What started with, a close count and a fairly routine procedure, it really seems to have opened up into a much broader discussion about how elections are run, how they're challenged.
That's right. I mean, while the partial hand recount itself is a step provided for in the law, the challenge to this particular election, it went beyond just recounting.
How so?
Well, it quickly involved legal battles. We saw cases filed in both state and federal courts.
Right.
And these raised some pretty fundamental questions, didn't they, about what makes an election fair and the rules that govern the voting process itself.
So it really shifted from just the numbers, the counting, to the legal framework around it.
Definitely.
So this deep dive, then, it's going to look beyond just the recount numbers. We need to get into the legal arguments, the court decisions.
Yeah, and what this all means for how people view the process.
Right. For you as a voter, maybe in North Carolina, or even just someone interested in election integrity anywhere, how do you view this? It really highlights the complexities, doesn't it?
It does. Ensuring fair and accurate elections while also respecting the rights of every single person who cast a ballot. It's a tough balance.
A very real-world example of that delicate balance. You've got election accuracy on one side, upholding the legal process, and safeguarding the right to vote on the other.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's move on then. How did things actually unfold after that initial request for the partial hand recount? What were the key moments that really changed the game?
Well, first, the county boards, they got to work on those partial hand recounts as requested.
Right, doing the 3% sample counts.
Exactly. But even while those counts were happening, the legal challenges were being filed. Things were happening in parallel.
And the North Carolina Republican Party, they seemed pretty vocal about supporting Judge Griffin's actions.
They were. They voiced strong support for his legal challenges, and they emphasized, the need for clarity and accountability.
Accountability regarding what specifically?
Particularly regarding the significant number of ballots that they believed had issues under state law. They felt these shouldn't have been counted, or at least needed review.
And we're talking about quite a few ballots, weren't we? Something like over 60,000.
That was the figure being discussed, yes. Over 60,000 ballots they had concerns about.
What were the specific problems they pointed to with those ballots?
The challenge is mainly centered on a few things. One was voters whose initial registration, it lacked either a driver's license number or the last 4 digits of their Social Security number.
Yeah. Okay, registration data issues, what else?
There were also questions about photo ID requirements, specifically for absentee ballots sent to military and overseas voters.
Ah, the Uokia voters.
Right. And finally, ballots cast by individuals who, it was argued, had never actually established residency in North Carolina.
Okay, so registration info, overseas voter ID, and residency. Got it. And this is where the state courts got involved, leading to some pretty important decisions about these specific ballots.
Yes, exactly. The North Carolina Supreme Court eventually issued a ruling on these challenged ballots.
What did they decide?
It was a bit mixed. They ultimately decided that a large chunk, roughly those 60,000 ballots where the registration info wasn't fully complete, they decided those would be counted.
Okay, why? What was the reasoning?
Well, their reasoning was basically that the State Board of Elections itself bore some responsibility for not adequately ensuring proper registration initially, kind of an administrative failing.
So the voters shouldn't be penalized for that.
That seemed to be the gist. However, they did order that a smaller number of ballots, those from overseas voters who had never lived in North Carolina, should be excluded.
Okay, so some counted, some excluded. What about the military and overseas ID issue?
Initially, yes. The state court also required that those military and overseas voters who hadn't provided photo ID, they should get an extra 30 days to provide it.
That process called curing the ballot?
Exactly. They called for a cure period for those specific ballots.
So a complicated state court decision hitting different ballot categories differently, but then the federal court stepped in. What triggered that?
Well, a federal judge, Richard Myers, he ultimately issued an order that basically required the certification of the Supreme Court race results, the results showing Allison Riggs in the lead.
So he stopped the state court's process. Why?
Judge Myers essentially sided with the arguments that removing ballots at that late stage, after the election had already happened and been certified at the county level, that would infringe upon the due process and equal protection rights of the voters involved.
Ah, the timing was key.
Very key. He specifically disagreed with the state court's directive about allowing military and overseas voters to cure their ID issues.
Why disagree with that? Seems reasonable to let them fix it.
His point was that state law, as it stood at the time of the election, didn't explicitly require photo ID for those specific voters in that specific way. Therefore, you couldn't add that requirement or even the cure period for it after they'd already voted.
Okay, so the federal judge's view was basically you can't change the rules of the game after the game's been played.
That's a good way to put it.
And that sounds like it kind of lined up with some of the dissenting voices on the state Supreme Court too, right? I remember reading about that.
Yes, that's a critical point. The principle that election rules need to be clear before voting starts and not applied retroactively, that's really a cornerstone of fair elections. And Judge Myers emphasized that Griffin's challenges, because they came after the election, were effectively seeking to change those rules after the fact.
Which could potentially disenfranchise voters who followed the rules as they understood them at the time.
Exactly. Voters who acted under the existing regulations when they cast their ballot.
Okay, let's just recap quickly to make sure we've got the sequence straight. Griffin asks for the partial hand recount. That process starts, but then legal challenges pop up focusing on tens of thousands of specific ballots.
Right, based on registration, ID, residency concerns.
The state Supreme Court makes rulings count some, exclude others, allow cures for a group.
A complex ruling, yes.
And then a federal judge steps in and basically says, hold on, certify the results based on the count you already did.
Pretty much. Based on the initial counts that followed the machine recount and the official county canvassing period back in December.
Right. The canvass is that official sign-off period after the initial machine counts.
Correct. The federal court order essentially stopped the state court's rulings regarding those specific ballot issues from being implemented and mandated, finalizing the results based on that earlier official tally.
Wow. This whole situation, it really highlights a fundamental tension, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
On one side, you've got this critical need to make sure elections are accurate, secure, that the count is right.
Paramount.
But on the other side, you have the constitutional rights of voters. Due process, equal protection under the law, these are just as important.
Absolutely. And the legal arguments really drilled down into whether changing the rules for ballot eligibility after voting violated those fundamental rights.
There was clearly a major disagreement on whether certain ballots were cast, in line with the rules as they were understood when people voted.
That was the crux of it, yeah.
And I mean, all of this is playing out against the backdrop of ongoing, pretty intense conversations about election integrity, especially in North Carolina.
That's true. It's not happening in a vacuum.
We know the Republican Party there has made this a really significant focus. They even set up a dedicated committee, right? An election integrity committee.
Yes. The North Carolina Republican Party has stated very clearly that election integrity is a top priority for them.
What does that committee actually do?
Well, their election integrity committee gets involved in various things like recruiting poll observers, recommending potential changes to election laws and rules.
So policy and personnel.
Right. And generally just working from their perspective to build greater confidence in the electoral process.
Yeah.
They've actually received some national recognition for those efforts.
And this isn't just a North Carolina issue, is it? This focus on election rules and integrity?
Not at all.
We see organizations like the Heritage Foundation, for instance. They've developed their own election integrity scorecard.
That's right, which evaluates the election laws of different states based on a particular set of criteria they recommend for fairness and security.
So it gives us a kind of broader context, a national picture of this ongoing debate about election administration.
Exactly. The Heritage Foundation scorecard offers that comparative look, assessing election laws across all 50 states and D.C. against what they consider best practices. It reflects that nationwide dialogue about how elections are run and secured.
So, okay, when you take all this together,
Yeah.
this incredibly close election, the recounts, the legal fights in state and federal court, the different interpretations of the rules, it really poses a significant question for you, the listener. What does this whole series of events suggest about the current level of trust maybe in the electoral process? Not just in North Carolina, perhaps, but maybe more broadly.
Yeah, what does it say about confidence?
Right. And what might be the long-term consequences for voter confidence, for the future of how elections are conducted and contested, especially when races are this close and the legal challenges get this intense.
It's definitely something important for all of us to think about moving forward. How do we navigate these tensions?